Thank you very much, Elizabeth. I will now do the land acknowledgement. CCD acknowledges the homelands of the Indigenous peoples of this place we now call Canada, and honors the many territorial keepers of the land on which we work.
Thank you, April.
Over to you, Heather.
Thank you. My name is Heather Walkus, and I'm honored to be the National Chair of the Council of Canadians for Disabilities. Welcome to our webinar at National Accessibility Awareness Week. I believe every week is National Accessibility Awareness Week. I think we all have a role to play in bringing awareness. Just by existing, we bring awareness. This is our week to talk to each other, and also to talk to other Canadians who are learning about how our environment and attitudes disable almost 1/4 of the population of Canada. We are okay with our bodies and how they work. We don't consider ourselves less than or disabled. We do, however, become disabled because of our environment and attitudes towards us. As we move towards a better understanding of the disability movement, we also have become very clear that it includes all of us. All of us have a role to play in the disability movement around changing it to be accessible and attitudes change. And today it's my honor to bring 3 people together to have a robust discussion around intersectionality. That is also a part of awareness. It's not just about ramps and speech readers and ways of maneuvering around in society. It's also about how we work with each other on a human-to-human basis. And going back to the land acknowledgement, everybody does one. But what do we do when we leave the meeting after the land acknowledgement, or even in the meeting? Are we coming forward with our best selves? Are we treating each other with dignity? Are we throwing our garbage into landfills continuously? Are we looking at the healing of Mother Earth? As we look at the healing, this all people are doing around how we've been divided in society. And so intersectionality is a really important discussion, and also a really important process of how we work with each other with dignity, with respect, in solidarity and allyship. And so today I'd like to ask each of our 3 speakers on the panel to introduce themselves, starting with Elliot, then Lisa, and then Ben. Over to you, Elliot.
Thanks, Heather. Hello, everyone. I was going to say good morning, but I know that's not the case because there's people from across the country. For me, over here in Alberta, it is the morning still. My pronouns are he, him, and I am in my day job, a service coordinator at End of the Rainbow Foundation. We're an organization that supports LGBTQI+ migrants and refugees. I have very active animals in the background, so I will apologize if you hear the sound of them running around. Hopefully they're quiet. And I am also I'm the LGBTQ+ alternate member at large at CCD. And I'm happy to be here. Thanks.
Thank you, Elliot. Lisa, up in Nunavut.
Yes, hello. My name is Lisa Spencer. I am an agender disabled and neurodivergent person. I have a shaved head, wearing blue light glasses, and a plaid red shirt with a green undershirt. And behind me is a backdrop of the Northern Lights. I'm here on behalf of Nunavummi Disabilities Makina-Swaktiit Society, better known as NDMS. We are an Inuit-led organization based out of Iqaluit, Nunavut. I myself am a white person, but I do have other identities that bring me to this conversation, as well as sharing some insights that we have gathered from a recent environmental scan across 20 different communities in the territory about what disability means and accessibility means for Nunavummiut. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Lisa. And I'd like to ask Ben to introduce yourself. And right after that, I'm going to ask Alan, I'm just giving you a heads up, to set up the first poll. Ben, go ahead.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you so much, Heather. And it's such a pleasure to be here with you, Lisa and Elliot, and join the panel. My name is Bernardo Quaco. Everybody calls me Ben, and I am a Black male. Every time I have to describe my shirt, because I don't really know the color, I'm always like, it's a nice shirt, so we're going to go by that. And I have a white wall in the background, I believe. So it's such a pleasure being here. And speaking about intersectionality, I know I've been working with the CCD, kind of a member in and out. And then also I am currently working at the CNIB as a program lead of advocacy and accessibility and community engagement, which really pushes for diversity and inclusion. My pronouns are he and him, and I really look forward to today's conversation.
Thank you, Ben. I'd like to ask the first poll to go out. What we've decided to do is do a poll at the beginning and at the end of the webinar to get an idea of how well we did and also what your thoughts are. And I'll turn it over to, thank you, that I believe the poll has come up. And if all of you in the audience could fill it out, I'd really appreciate it.
On a scale of 1 to 10.
How are we doing, Alan, with our responses? Are we about at? We've got 21 out of 36 people so far. I believe it just told me. We'll give it another 30 seconds, 45 seconds. Anybody else who wants to fill it out?
Two item S. Polls list. Zoom meeting.
Okay, we can cut the poll off now. Thank you, Alan. And Alan, if you would be so kind as to
Share results disabled button. Zoom meeting.
to start the video that we have once the poll is finished. I keep getting things flipped up.
Is it still showing?
It's coming, it keep coming up. It says share results. Yeah, it's now it's saying starting again.
Close button.
Is anyone else having it come up?
Same for me.
Me
Is
as well,
it
Heather.
gone
This
now,
is Elliot.
or is it still there?
Okay, it's gone from mine because I pressed delete.
Because it says ended on my end, so I'm just not sure.
It just came back up again.
Share results disabled.
Hold on.
Close button.
National Accessibility Awareness Week. We have some accessibility, except it has a mind of its own. Okay, I'm not seeing it come back. So I think we're ready, Alan, if you don't mind, to start the video.
Okay. Can people see?
something came up big and so
Okay.
I think it's ready.
Oh, wait, give me 1 sec, sorry. I totally forgot to share my audio.
Oh, that's important.
In between two sets of red and black lines, the title Intersectionality appears. Graphics dissolve to head and shoulders shot of Fran speaking.
Although the term intersectionality has been around for over 30 years, it is only recently that the term has been taken up by civil rights movements. But what does this term mean in relationship to deaf people and people with disabilities?
Screen dissolves to white. Letters appear one at a time, posing the following questions. What is intersectionality? Intersectionality is a way of understanding how more than one marginalized identity, such as disability, gender, race, indigeneity, sexual orientation, age, class, etc., coexist together. Head and shoulders shot of Ben.
Hello, everybody. My name is Ben, and I am a Black male with parents who were born in Ghana, West Africa. And I also live with partial sight of retinitis pigmentosa.
Head and shoulders shot of Skittles.
I'll go by Skittles. I'm a person of color, just like 1.3 billion of me in the world, or more than that. And obviously, I'm not afraid to say I have a disability. I also have a seasonal affective disorder. Identify as a woman of color because I came out as a trans, I think about 10 years ago.
Head and shoulders shot of Kelly.
I am an Indigenous woman with an intellectual disability who is a mother.
Head and shoulders of Janelle using sign language speaking through an interpreter.
The intersections or the crossroads that we see. And as situations arise, we may pick one side to stand on. Well, that's not possible when we have so much intersectionality. We can relate that to a fruit or a vegetable with the several layers that comprise these things. As humans, we are complex individuals. We live different lives. We have different experiences. And so when we understand these external and internal challenges and oppressions and pressures, we take on differing perspectives.
Fran.
I am someone who identifies as an older, cisgender female, white-skinned, and is part of the LGBT community. But I'm also someone who lives with different disabilities. I'm a wheelchair user, and I'm also someone who's hard of hearing. But I do not experience and live out these identities separately. They all combine to make me what I am and who I am. My different identities are not kept separate and distinct. Rather, they are blended in different systems of oppression such as queerphobia, patriarchy, ableism, and ageism.
Head and shoulders shot of Elliot.
When we use the term intersectionality, we are talking about groups of people who have been set aside and not included in society. We are talking about people who have less power than the dominant group. Therefore, a key component of the idea of intersectionality is marginalization. We all live with intersecting identities, but the problem occurs when the systems and attitudes that run our society discriminate against these identities. The more marginalized identities a person has, the deeper their experiences of various forms of oppression are.
Skittles.
There will be times when I'm outside, like if I'm out in the world, like it's not all the time I face it, but occasionally I would face racism.
Kelly.
Being an Indigenous woman with an intellectual disability is harder for me because there is a lack of education in terms of government supports. They're very limited. There's barriers. There's lack of understanding within the government, those that work in government, of what an intellectual disability is. The way that society paints certain communities, such as the Indigenous and in Black communities, for example, of, you know, that we're all troubled individuals. We're the category meaning, okay, a mother, such as myself, you know, mental health issues and, you know, like, okay, labels of can't afford to support your child. You know, you got a mental health issue, therefore your child's unstable. Let's, you know, put, you know, involve it in, you know, child protective services.
Fran.
People with disabilities and deaf people are everyone. They are Black, queer, Indigenous, and have diverse genders. Yet, just as disability has not been included in other civil rights movements, the disability rights movement has not done a very good job at recognizing intersectionality.
Janelle.
If you really look closely at the deaf movement, it's predominantly white, and there's a lot of activity. But where are our Asian and Black and Indigenous community members? There's a lot of comparisons, and we need to stop these comparisons and respect the diversity and differences and include everyone in these movements.
Ben.
So it is very important that the disability movement diversifies the scope, because disability is indiscriminate. So anybody could have a disability. It doesn't matter your culture, it doesn't matter your ethnicity, it doesn't matter your race, it doesn't matter your sexual orientation. You can live with a disability. So it's so important that representation is key, because there are people who are missing out on services and missing out on aspects to disability, so resources. And this is because they're not represented. They don't feel that they're being seen. For example, me as a Black man, it's difficult to admit that you have a disability because of it has that stereotype of vulnerability. But when you start getting Black men who are proud of their disability, who are resilient from the disability, it provides people or youth to look at it and make changes and be proud of their disability and reach their full potential. So it's so important that when we look at these intersecting identities, that we could clearly pinpoint the issues that a community is going through. So for example, when you look at police brutality, sometimes we only get the scope or the perspective from someone who's able-bodied. But what about someone who does live with a disability, who is a Black male?
Janelle.
We need to consider race, gender. Those are easily identifiable. However, the concepts of language, deafness, and disability tend to be excluded from these conversations.
Ben.
Because of my identities, I almost feel like I am an anomaly. So when people think of someone who lives with a disability, they don't quite think of someone who looks like me, someone who likes to wear earrings and someone who's a little bit muscular. So I love my identities.
Janelle.
We need to work together, take the time, be cognizant, work toward these goals, continue to spread these messages. And once we continue to do that, we will mobilize, but we need to consider the diversity.
Words appear around a freeze frame shot of Janelle. Intersectionality, inclusion, diversity. Over a white background, credits roll in.
Thank you, Alan, for doing that, setting that up. That's a video we just produced in the last 2 months, and we are very honored that 2 of the people in the video are here today. And one of the things that I've been thinking about intersectionality a lot, and we've been siloed in movements many times. So there's the movement aspect of intersectionality, where there's the civil rights movement that also included the women's movement, finally, included the LGBTQ movement, finally. Many different movements working because of the oppression, because of how they were considered less than, and not actively being supported within our systems. Our systemic discrimination and attitudes really did a number on a lot of people, and collectively that harmed all of us because we were all just waiting for our turn at being harmed. And so what happened was all of these groups, many developed very powerful voices and very powerful analysis of what was going on for their community, their diverse community. As we know, not all blind people see the same. My way of managing through my life is different than Ben's, although we're both considered blind. And so it was really important as we realized that the intersections between all of us and the things that were oppressing all of us were very similar. Colonization and the systems that harm people harm all of us. So that's the systems and that's the movement piece. There's another part of this, and there's probably many I haven't thought of yet, and other people have, is the personal. What has happened to us as individuals with these intersection identities because we can't separate ourselves? I'm 68, I'm blind. I have other identities that impact how I am treated, how I think about the world, and how I move throughout the world. And so those things can't be separated. I can't be chopped up. And so I am part of several movements, not just one, the disability movement. And so many of us have really spent a lifetime attempting to find our common ground to work in solidarity and in allyship without speaking on behalf of someone else. That is our challenge right now. How do we ensure people are at the table and notice when they're not and say they must be? It is important to me that people are at the table as it is that someone deaf have an interpreter. If we don't have people from a broad cross-section of people who are pushed to the margins, we didn't go there willingly, then we may want to say, I'm going to stop this meeting or I can't participate unless we ensure those voices are here to speak on them for themselves. I will not speak for them. And those are the kind of challenges we have right now in the movement, that we're all trying to figure out how to discuss that. So Elliot, I know you didn't want to go first, but maybe me talking a bit can flow to you and then to Lisa and Ben, and then you can just speak whenever you feel like it, because this is a discussion of the three of you, between the three of you. Elliot, do you want to start?
Sure, Heather, thanks. I did actually jot down a couple of markers to myself as the video was playing, so I'm not totally flying on the floating on my own whims. One of the things that I do think maybe wasn't mentioned in the video that I did want to bring up, and I'm hoping that Lisa and Ben have some thoughts on, is I think it's easy to kind of fall into this thought that intersectionality is very fixed, and also that that it is a tool that I kind of lost that train of thought. But the fixedness is something that I did want to bring up, because I think particularly for people with invisible disabilities, and a lot of for people like myself who live with mental health challenges, and who are neurodiverse, that the way that disability shows up in my life is not fixed. It can be quite fluid. And so how those parts of my intersection show up and how they either are challenges or opportunities. And I actually prefer to think of intersectional aspects as challenges and opportunities, because that's also part of that not fixedness, depending on the context of where I'm at in that moment will impact how it affects my day-to-day life. So a really good example of that is my education. I have been very privileged to be able to have very high level of education, but in relation to my autism in particular, that actually becomes quite a drawback, because it means that I am not eligible for a lot of supports, and I'm not eligible for a lot of access to mental health professionals, and all of those kinds of assessment pieces and all of those things. So when we think about how our intersections affect us day to day, it's part of my identity, and this is how it always emerges. It can be very different, and it can actually be challenging to navigate that piece of it, to not know how it's going to show up at any one given time. And because some of it can be completely invisible, it means that outside people can have different expectations than the lived reality of what I'm experiencing at any given moment as well, which can further lead to tension. And so I think even from like my perspective, like working and meeting other people, it's always a good reminder to myself that there's a lot of stuff going on that I don't know. And so it's important that I meet them where they are, and I give them the space to speak from their experience and not project what I think they might be experiencing based on what I can visually see, because that's not fair to either of us. And I will invite either Ben or Lisa as they feel led to kind of chime in.
Hi, it's Lisa. I really love what you started with, the idea that intersectionality is not fixed, it's rather fluid. And I think that we can tie that back to what Heather had said about the personal. Our different identities kind of make up who we are and how we understand the world and our experiences and our trauma and our, our education, our family life, everything that makes us human beings. It can create preconceived notions about other people, not just about ourselves. And sometimes we react or respond using those preconceived notions, and it creates miscommunication because we don't understand each other. So I really think that when it comes to intersectionality, it's about a negotiation of identities, putting forward what I know and my lived experience, and I'm going to speak from that or communicate from that perspective, and you're going to respond from your experiences, and together we kind of have to come up with a collaborative solution and meet in the middle. When we're talking about the fluidity of identities, disability itself is fluid, whether you are born with a disability, acquire a disability through illness, injury, or age. Perhaps you have a chronic illness, or you have one that's episodic. When you look at LGBT, there are many people who have kind of hidden that part of themselves because they've been conditioned to feel shame or guilt. There are people who are discovering their sexual identities, discovering their gender much later on in life, and disability as well, when we're looking at the neurodivergent movement. Indigenous people as well, First Nations, Inuit, and Métis, many of them were denied their culture, their heritage, and their tradition. And so they're rediscovering their ancestry and where they come from and what has amounted to who they are and what they know. So yes, identities are extremely fluid, which means intersectionality would be extremely fluid. And when we talk about intersectionality from like a theoretical perspective, we're really, we're looking at, as you'd mentioned, with visible disabilities or race or gender, or what Janelle had said, some of the things that are readily apparent. We might perceive somebody to have a more oppressed identity than someone else. And we kind of create a hierarchy of oppression, who has it worse and who has it better. And we need to get away from that dichotomy, that idea of the binary, rather, of privilege or oppression, right? Everybody is somewhere in the middle. We're all a mixture, and it involves communicating with one another and getting to know each other and our identities and building that relationship. Ben, go ahead.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Lisa. And thank you, Elliot, for raising that discussion on looking at intersectionality, and something that wasn't discussed in the video. And just like the theme of you folks bringing intersectionality as fluid. And I remember when I first came in contact with the term of intersectionality, great description on how individuals live their life as a person with a disability, racialized person, as a man. And I had a discussion with a counselor from my MSW placement. And even looking at intersectionality, we're coming in contact to any form of oppression. Sometimes it could be looked at as interchangeable. So I remember a term kind of interchangeability as well as intersectionality, because even me with my identity as a Black male, sometimes disability is not even apparent, or sometimes my race is not even apparent with disability. And then next thing you know, then it crosses over. So just having that understanding that it's not a rigid term where like we all are seen with that X of intersectionality, but sometimes the fact that even that single identity can impact us and be a layer on top of our identities. So instead of like crossing it over, laying over those identities. And such great points when speaking about how it's fluid, and definitely look forward to the rest of the conversation for sure. So yeah, I don't know if anybody wants to comment on that.
I'm just thinking, with what all of you have said, is I am bothered by what especially Elliot said around there's an expectation now that he has a degree that somehow his disabilities disappear. That, that happened to me as well. There's an assumption made that you've reached a certain level in this society, so therefore everything else is irrelevant. And that is systemic oppression or systemic discrimination. And it's frustrating. You see it all the time in government supports, how fast they're taken away when one thing changes. So that's very systemic in keeping us caught up in this cycle of not being accepted as we are with equity.
And this is Ben speaking, Heather, and even to kind of piggyback on what you're saying, sometimes economics could be a part of it too. And the fact that maybe you're making a certain amount of money. So you stay out of that conversation of being someone with a disability and having a conversation about transportation, right? Because, oh, you can afford it, so you can't say anything, right?
And that's that class system coming back to bite us all. That we get that laid on us. Oh, you come from privilege. You can afford to buy a new iPhone. So therefore, you're not part of us. You've got to be really ground down to be able to be in the conversation. And yet, we don't know unless we listen to each other what people have gone through and are continuing to go through. And that you're exactly right. That class, that economic things don't change the fact you're in a wheelchair. Don't change the fact if you try to go somewhere and you can't get there from here. You might get there, but in a taxi that's accessible, but once you get there, you may not be able to get in the door, or people pat you on the head. And that's something when I'm in a wheelchair, because I have some episodic disabilities, drives me crazy. But I digress. Where we go, where else do you see intersectionality and just the words sometimes? And I'm so glad you brought up about the fluidity and the part, Ben, that what was the other word you used besides
Interchangeability.
Interchangeality? It's a great word, because it's true. How I operated in the world at 20 is very different, and how I was treated at 20 was very different than it is now. I mean, if I was 20 right now, I'd have all sorts of supports when I went out in the world. At 68, people tend to just, oh, she's just old and out there, and ignore me. So there's certain times of my life that things change by just nature of my age, and also changed in nature of whether I said something or not. People always thought I was okay until I was at a meeting and expressed my concerns. And then they went, whoa, she actually has a mind and can think. And that's something, when people don't say anything, there's an assumption made about them. Lisa, do you have any thoughts around that, or where we're going in this idea of intersectionality? And what are some of the things that you've experienced that maybe, if you wish to share, that impact how you are able to react? Because some people have more control than you may have.
Well, first, it is Lisa speaking. First and foremost, I just wanted to mention that I do love the idea of interchangeable identities as well as intersectional, because even though, you know, many of us embody multiple identities, we always make a conscious decision as to which one to put first, or which one to highlight or rely on. As Elliot was saying, with the idea of no longer being disabled when you have a degree, you know, in academic spaces, you might want to downplay, not necessarily by choice, but you downplay, you know, your neurodivergence, or in areas of disabled spaces, you might downplay your academic history because of that societal expectation that, you know, if you have too much affordances or not enough, or you don't have as many different identities or backgrounds as others, that your perspective is not valued or shared. And it doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens everywhere. There is racism amongst the disability community. There's absolutely ableism amongst the you know, the Black, Indigenous, and people of color. There is heterosexism. There is sexism amongst all varieties of people. And so when we enter a space, we kind of have this idea as to, like, who am I in this room? And it's a way of self-preservation to protect yourself, to minimize the hurt and the pain, and to not be completely vulnerable in a group. And it reminds me of, Heather, what you had said in the beginning about these movements being siloed, right? This idea that the civil rights movement wasn't really encompassing disability, just as the disability movement and even the social model isn't really encompassing of other perspectives. Specifically, what we have noticed in the North from many Inuit with disability, the idea of disability is seen as incapable or unable, and so there's a stigma about using the label or adopting the label of being disabled. So people are hesitant to admit that that's part of who they are because they don't want to be seen as incapable. Then there's also the issue of going to get medical or mental health assistance for a disability and having racism at play in terms of getting the appropriate medication or the right language and for understanding your own care. All of these things affect you in different ways, in different proportions throughout your day, and it is very much interchangeable. Elliot, would you like to add?
Thanks, Lisa. This is Elliot speaking. There's a couple of thoughts here, and one of the things is that I think I'd really like to invite people to lean into those places where the different parts of their intersections seem to rub against each other in awkward or odd ways, like those times where you do notice that you are having to prioritize one part or another for safety, because I think that's key to us being able as like a collective find where those natural allies are, and start to build a cross movement. And one of the things that I love about being part of discussions that do bring multiple voices to the table is that it starts to build relationships of trust. I can trust that I don't need to worry about raising other concerns because the people are there and they will speak to the parts that are important to them and that affect them. And I only need to worry about speaking to the parts that I'm familiar with because somebody else is there to speak for themselves. And I think, like, for me as a trans person who works with the LGBTQI community, particularly right now, bodily autonomy is something that I see as a really good opportunity to start to have fruitful discussions about how the disability community and the LGBTQI community could really work well together. And I would actually say that's a really good place to invite women in as well, even if they're not part of the LGBTQI community, because there's a lot of discussion, particularly from more conservative sides of our society, that are looking to infringe upon bodily autonomy for a wide variety of people. So if we can focus on where the commonalities of what we're all kind of working and hoping to move towards, rather than all the different parts where, you know, we're not working towards the same thing necessarily, that I think we have a really good opportunity to move everybody forward rather than leave some people behind.
Ben, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, of course, and some very great points. And Elliot, when you were mentioning having multiple identities and just multiple people sitting at the table, a thought that came to my head, and this is what I envision in inclusion, especially when you reach that branch out to other individuals with other types of identities, is I just picture a door, right? Like constructing a door. And supposedly I was constructing the door. Obviously, I would make the doorway a door that fits only me, right? Okay, if I want to save time, I'll make it my height, I'll make it enough for the width for me to fit in. But I find that once you start getting people to the table, you start understanding that you have to make the door wider, you have to make the door taller, maybe you have to shape it a little differently, maybe you have to put in a certain direction, maybe you can't have a door to it. So I almost think that inclusion is that, where we construct a pathway or a doorway that everybody fits, where we don't even have to think of renovating the door, constructing the door. And the more voices that we have from a multitude of different identities and just a whole plethora of different identities constructs that perfect door where everybody fits and everybody's words are being heard and people are accepted within different aspects of society.
That's a really good analogy about that. And it really leads me to think about how we work, but also we're all brought up in a society where we're set up to have those silos and set up to only build a door of our own that works for us. But as we heal, as we're doing our wellness, working on our wellness, we also start to understand there's different ways of organizing, different ways of knowing than the classic sort of Eurocentric colonial way of thinking of a hierarchy and someone is always at the top. And we start to flatten that and start to just go into a circle and listen. And certainly one of the things you said, Julie, is really critical is now because of the way society has hit Indigenous people and Black people and what has been done in that area. Traditional knowledge in many cultures is not that there's no word for disability. There's no societal construct or a way of identifying people with disabilities. So if you don't have that word, then with the society that kind of took over yours, you now feel less than because there's no cultural inclusion. And so we're always expecting people to understand the system that oppresses us. What has not happened well, which is really important to me, is that that system and the people that keep that system going stop and start to listen and think and start to learn the language, learn ASL, learn how a screen reader works, learn some Braille, like learn how other people think, organize, believe in, and come correct to people. We're constantly people are coming at us inappropriately. And so that's a very important part of how we organize too, is how do we shift people's perceptions, understanding, and start to organize in different ways and work together in those different ways that you were talking about, Elliot. That's a big challenge because there is no roadmap for that change. We are creating it as we go along. And it's going to take many of us, sometimes, you know, frustration and a lot of tears and sometimes anger and a lot of willingness to trust that this is the process that we own and that we can create the path that we can now ask government to say, no, that way isn't okay. This is a way we want to be. These are some of the off-ramps. What are some of those off-ramps? You're bringing those up. Those are critical as we go forward, because we're not the only people that should be fighting for inclusion, equity in this country. Everyone should be. And it's responsibility, not just ours in the movement. I've often in my little town seen people say to me, oh, well, you know about accessibility. Why don't you do this? Because my grandfather's wheelchair couldn't get off the curb because there's no curb cut. I said, well, you're perfectly capable of going to the village office and getting them to deal with that. I don't have to do it on your behalf. And they're like, really? And it's like, yeah, it's part of your responsibility as a citizen to include all of us. And so that's the message I put out to those who may think it's only our job. What do you guys think about that?
I agree. And just to borrow from Ben and his analogy, when we're talking, sorry, my apologies, it is Lisa speaking. When we're talking about diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility, you know, these hot button or hot topic issues, we tend to say who's at the table. And I think it's really important that we take it a little bit further and question, what is this table? Like when we, the table signifies decision making. The table is colonialism. The table is this system of government, this system of education, this system of family services, this system of oppression, because we have this ideal framework of how a country is supposed to be run and how the people or society are supposed to make decisions in these spaces. So just as you were saying, Heather, with a friend who asked you, you know, you could do something with this, in that way, we need to empower people to recognize that they can go above and beyond the table. They can put forward ideas and social innovation to empower people who aren't in that space. Because oftentimes when somebody is privileged enough to get into that room and to be a voice at that table or share their perspective, it becomes tokenistic, and it can be difficult to really push an agenda forward when you have so many questions as to what you represent, and if you represent it well enough, or, you know, are you speaking for your entire group or multiple groups? So you need more perspective than just one Indigenous person, one Black person, one gay person, or one disabled person. You need communities to come together, as Elliot had said. And in that way, we need to go above and beyond this table idea. We need to think about the spaces, the kitchens where, you know, people are talking and sharing coffee, the community centers where youth are engaging with one another. We need to really invite and encourage those conversations in those spaces, not just at the table.
So maybe we don't need the table. Maybe we need to create whatever it is to get away from that thinking and that perspective. And that is, what do you do starting tomorrow from this conversation? What are some of the things we can do to do an off-ramp from that power table? Because so many of us get caught up into that. We're reacting to government, invited to the meetings. I'd like to have our own meetings our way and invite them and do a report card on them, but how well they're doing. So flip the power imbalance to empowering ourselves. Am I hearing that correctly?
Yeah, I think so. And it involves a community coming together, all age groups, not just people in, you know, policy or decision-making situations, but we need to work together collaboratively. We need to have more relationships and more meaningful discussions. I think that's what's important. And the more that we come together and the more that we have these conversations, the more we find those common ground, as Elliot was saying. And with that common ground becomes empowerment. And, you know, you galvanize a group to challenge the dominant. And yeah, I think you're on the right track, Heather. I hope I'm explaining it well enough. So thank you.
You are for me, Elliot.
Thanks, Heather. It's Elliot. I love the fact that you mentioned reaction, because I think so much of the work that is done is either in reaction to something that has happened, or else as an kind of invitation by maybe not well-meaning parts of the establishment to try and prevent a reaction from occurring. But very tied to that. And I think in reality, we need to be moving towards not thinking about accessibility or inclusion as being specific to like meetings or specific to work or specific to this or this or this, but rather an embedded part of just the way that we all live together as humans. And I think that's kind of the hope, is that we find ways to make this just part of how we naturally engage with each other, not how we react to things when we start to worry that something might have barriers to participation. And I think shifting towards not being reactive in that way is a key part.
Ben?
Of course, and I don't know if anybody's looking at me while everybody's talking, but my wheels are just spinning. I wasn't supposed to learn something this panel. All jokes aside, no, honestly, I'm learning a lot for sure. And the aspect I'm still thinking about, it's 2 points. So one of my points would be language. So we're making mention, Heather, of language, and I swear to this notion where I feel like when it does come to intersecting identities, especially I'm going to look in culture and race, right? Sometimes you need someone to metaphorically speak the language of that group before people actually understand. So African culture, when it comes to disability, when you even look at disability and the translation of my parents' language of tree, disability in translation is incapable. And if you were to translate that from tree to English, it would be incapable. So even for someone like me and what I have learned and what I have known and the exposure to disability, I feel like for myself and other individuals, and I gotta say shout outs to Ashe, where I'm a board of directors of partnership in working with them, to switch up and say, okay, that may be the language, but no, it's not incapable. And to switch up that aspect, because those are the subtle aspects that are oppressing individuals with disabilities, or just that fact that even when we go national or national wide, how people have the eye on disability or what they look at disability as, and to address those little subtle things, because I feel like those little subtle snowballs become these big boulders for sure. And then the other point of at the table, and it's as it was mentioned with at the table, as Lisa, you were making mention, I was thinking, because it's hard to be heard if you don't say in a certain way. And like, I totally agree that there should be getting opinions from people who are in the communities, or even at a kitchen table, or even at the water cooler, and just the real life instances. But I feel like just how the world is structured and just policy, it needs a person to kind of represent like a group of people. And I don't know how to explain this. I don't know where I'm going, but it almost seems like to filter someone knowledgeable to have that word at the table, right? Or to infiltrate the system. And then at the same time, people on the ground as well. So it's almost, in my mind, this big process. It's almost like this big factory where everybody has their own strengths and duties. Because I know it just seems a little hard when it's not that table to speak at, and it's just so much policy behind it. But I would really love to hear your opinions about that as well.
It's Lisa, Ben. Just to build on that, one of the things that we had discovered through NDMS with our conversations with various Inuit and Nunavummiut across the territory was that there's a little bit of a cultural disconnect between the way the government is run versus the way people lived in camps before relocation and colonization is, from the Inuit perspective, they had leaders who took care of their community and who were there to make decisions and to provide a kind of a sense of safety. But now, because of colonization and because of this government structure, those same leaders are now elected officials who are provided or who embody like a servant leadership. They revert back to the people to make decisions, and that is a disconnect for Inuit culture, to have the community come together when they're used to having one leader make that decision. So the process of deciding who's at that table is in itself a disconnect. And of course, when we factor in, language and metaphors, it's so powerful to find a commonality that everyone understands. So I certainly understand that at the table is a meaningful representation for decision making. Just with the government systems, the way they are set up, it is quite oppressive. The systemic ableism, systemic racism, systemic heterosexism, it's there and it's prevalent, and it gets people to think a certain way as to what is normal, what is appropriate, or what is socially acceptable. And then we operate under that assumption, and everyone who is different or weird or quirky or abnormal or deviant is seen as bad, negative, pitiful, burdensome, troublesome, criminal, or I could come up with a number of different words that are no longer appropriate, but there are prejudices that come along with that. And in order to break that down, and in order to create a system of government that is inclusive, we do need to really look at how we can change the system and not just try to stick additional pieces onto it, right? Like when we think about accessibility and trying to think about ways that we can get people who have a disability into, government spaces, is it going to work? Or should we bring the government to disability spaces? It's not so clear cut, and it's messy and it's fluid, and in and of itself, that's exactly what we're talking about with intersectionality, is where do we have these conversations and with whom? And that's why we need to make sure that we're as inclusive as possible. But in coming out of that, the results and the discussions and the passion and the empowerment that comes out of that, certainly there can be people who are, who have natural leadership, who can come forward and, lobby the governments or be at that table. But as a representative, an equitable representative of the community that they're representing.
May I
Go
jump in,
ahead.
Heather?
Yes, absolutely.
So this is Elliot. I think one of the things that strikes me as really important is that I think we need to expand what participation at the table looks like. I think we need to recognize that everybody has different strengths, different personalities, different needs, and how they might want to speak for themselves and to express themselves. And I think we get really hung up on this idea of what advocacy looks like, which a lot of people may not want to do in that way, right? They may not consent to being part of that. They may not feel like they're able to at this time. And so I think we need to also think about how, some people's roles may be through artistic expression. Some people's ways of participating may be through providing mentorship to people who want to participate but may not feel ready to yet. Some people's participation may be in just how we hold each other together and take care of each other as a collective, right? Like there's so many different things that need to be done and that can be done in so many different ways that people can participate. And I think we can too easily get fixed up on this, people speaking as advocates to corporations, to the government, to these structures and systems. And I think that really minimizes the potential that we all can bring. And yeah.
Thank you for that. I think what I'm going to do is open the floor for people to ask questions of you. So get ready for a rapid round of them. No, we have about 60 people on this webinar, including ourselves. I think it's 60, maybe it's 50. I'm just trying to hear on the talking program on my other computer. Does anyone have any questions or a comment that you'd like to make? Since we are looking at intersectionality and also inclusion, we'd like the people at this table or this this circle of fire that we are at. Do you have any comments or questions of our panel? You can put your hand up if you know how to do that. Real easy to sit back and listen, isn't it? And to have these deep thoughts. Then we put you on the spot because all of us are part of this change.
Janet Hunt asked to
Am I not hearing any
Hey,
ideas
Heather,
or thoughts?
this is
Go
Janet
ahead.
calling in, and I've been trying to find my raise my hand button and I
Oh.
can't find it. So excuse me, I'm just jumping in.
Jump in, Janet.
I'm jumping. I was pretty speechless when the subject of let's address this table we're all talking about. Lisa, what a fantastic thing to bring forward. I never really thought about it. We're always talking about we need to be invited to the table. We're never at the tables that matter. And what a fantastic thing to bring forward. What is this table? We need to work on changing that. And Heather, you've been saying for a long time that why are we always trying to get invited to the government tables? We need to be inviting them to ours. And I have no idea how you influence that change, but I think that's going to be really important going forward. And I just wanted to mention that. So thank you to everybody that brought that forward. That's a whole new concept that I hadn't really thought about until today. Thanks.
Thank you, Janet. Anyone else want to jump in? April?
Thank you, Heather. I was wondering, as this is Accessibility Week, if the panelists could share their thoughts on how an intersectionality lens could change the nature of accessibility for us.
Are you talking about accessibility in which way? In physical, or what is your lens on accessibility? Accessibility to each other?
I was thinking accessibility to our different organizations.
Okay.
Heather, it's Elliot. Can I take a stab at this? This is something that I've actually been thinking about a bit as I've been involved in working groups and such, because the focus and the mandate is always very focused on like barrier free from a disability perspective. And I think there's a lot of different ways that environments and spaces can be inaccessible from a wide lens of places. So to me, like, barrier free is kind of meaningless as a concept if I know that going into that space, I'm going to be misgendered, or I'm not going to have access to washrooms based on my gender, right? Like there's so many other ways that I'm not going to necessarily be safe in a space. And I think when we're looking and talking about how we make things barrier free, it needs to include all of those things, because it is meaningless if I go in and I'm excluded because of my intersections, even though I'm, it meets my sensory needs and it meets all of these other things. Yeah.
And
Lisa? Oh, sorry, Ben, go ahead.
Oh, no problem. No problem. Lisa, if you want to go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, so even sort of to piggyback on what Elliot was making mention, just I guess a little nitty gritty, the details, but it does come to accessibility. So, for example, accessing Braille books. So you could access Braille books or Audible books or alternative forms, but other Black writers who are having Braille books, or is the writers that talk about race or sexual identity or sexual orientation, and are those offered, right, instead of the common popular books, right? So that's even just one example, but just little simple things that I find that although accessibility and inclusion is provided, sometimes you still feel left out in your other identities.
Thank you, Ben. Lisa?
Yes, Lisa speaking. When we think about accessibility, we tend to think about pieces of equipment or methods of including when it comes to disability. But really, I mean, the root word of accessibility is access. And when it comes to intersectional identities, we want to make sure that everybody has access. And, you know, that does include disabled people as well as LGBT and those who are racialized. But it's not just about having possession of something or being able. It's also about can we afford to, you know, are we included in that space, or are we excluded because we don't have the financial means to get that that degree, or to be in a economic position to afford the time, you know, the time and energy as well to advocate. And as you had said, Elliot, not everyone wants to be in that position. And when we think of the history of, you know, the disability charitable organizations and movements such as, you know, Easter Seals and March of Dimes, and we think about, you know, it was primarily white parents who had the privilege to lobby the government and to create these decision makings, because they were able to have someone else look after their child. They were able to stay at home and research the legalese and had the financial means to be in spaces, you know, like the Supreme Court, where they could advocate for those needs. So affordability, not just financially, but in terms of time and energy, is a big thing to access. And that's also another piece in the disability movement, is the idea of spoons, or, you know, emotional bandwidth, or whatever you want to call it. But not everyone has that that capability to keep pushing forward, right? It is quite draining and it is quite traumatizing. Another piece to think about is the acceptability of it. And as much as we want to talk about inclusion, there's still parts of us that are aware of how society perceives us. And again, we may not want to put that forward, and we may not want to speak out for a group, or even for, you know, ourselves as individuals, if it puts us in harm's way. And so it does become a balance of personal safety as well as community engagement. And to Ben's point too, with the accessibility, it's also about, is it user friendly, and will people kind of allow me to use that space? So with intersectionality, as Elliot was saying, you know, if you have a sensory friendly washroom, but you're not able to access it because of your gender, or perhaps you have an all gendered washroom, but it's not wheelchair accessible, right? There's so many elements that play into a full, accessible, and user-friendly affordability space that everyone can have access to. Yeah, intersectionality plays a big part of that. It's not just about ramps, as Heather mentioned. Communication is one of the biggest barriers. Communication and attitudinal barriers are huge aspects of the social model of disability. And if we're not speaking each other's language and we're not understanding each other, and we develop, prejudice or bias against certain groups, we need to break that down in order to facilitate accessibility.
Thank you, Lisa. Komivi, you have your hand up.
Komivi, you're on mute.
Hello?
Hi, go ahead, Komivi, if I've said your name correctly. You're back on mute, I think.
Hello?
Hello, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Okay, bonsoir, bonsoir, bonsoir.
Yes, good evening, good afternoon. My name is Aliatsu Amigou, and I'm from Togo, Western Africa, French-speaking Africa, and I'm very much interested in this webinar, as it allows to make the connection between intersectionality and inclusion. I'm a visually impaired person, so I see that the connection between intersectionality and inclusion is very strong, and often we have the impression that the society gets quickly to conclusions regarding disabled persons. What I mean is that we do not experiment or try before getting to the conclusion. So this is a partial inclusion or even an exclusion approach. So I'd like to see with the panelists the question of disability in terms of accessibility is quite broad. And according to you, should we have conditions of accessibility before imagining the inclusion of disabled persons? Or is there a point of access for the inclusion of disabled persons before approaching inclusion in a more holistic way? So this is the question I wanted to ask the panel to have the point of view. Thank you.
Thank you. Go ahead, anyone on the panel.
This is Elliot speaking. I think because a lot of these conversations have been taking place for quite a long time within a variety of communities, I do think that we are not starting from ground zero. And so I do think that it is possible to start to build and have kind of minimum levels of accessibility that we start with and then learn from and then grow towards greater and greater accessibility. I don't think, yeah, I think I will stop there. And I hope that I understood the question properly. Yeah.
Anybody else, Ben or Lisa?
It's Lisa speaking. So yeah, I agree with Elliot that we do have kind of a framework to start from. We don't have to completely scrap our ideas of what disability is, particularly because when we don't recognize that there are people living within the margins of society, we run the risk of entering that, we're all human, all lives matter, all of us all together are equal. We do need to acknowledge that there are people who experience oppression and should be a larger part of that conversation to ensure that we ask questions about what it is to be normal, what it is to be a Canadian, what it is to be involved or in a decision-making process. So we do need to have some kind of mechanism or some kind of label to identify the people who have been previously left out of those conversations, so that we can amplify their perspective and make the existing framework more accessible and for everybody. If we scrap it all and start from the very beginning, we run the risk of building something that is exclusionary to certain groups.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because it's really important that we remember this is a process, not an event. This is part of culture. Culture doesn't sort of stagnate and stay in one space. It is ever developing, ever learning, ever bringing in more information to create a better society. And our cultures do that, and they change and they evolve, and they have to react to all nature of things. Many of us, if the one thing we all are facing is global warming and the changes in the environment and how that's going to affect and is impacting many, many people. So there's going to be a migration of people away from the oceans very soon, and has already started from different parts of the world. And we're not prepared for that. We're all going to be facing incredible amounts of pressure, and it really is going to take a lot of us over time to just keep these conversations going and work through, because we're going to find, I think, as we continue these conversations and our work, however we perceive our work in and around these movements, is around, it'll constantly be changing. And I have to say, with CCD, our work around human rights and social justice work is really at a place of opening up that whole conversation, because we've done so much work on accessibility and going to the Supreme Court and winning wins of, you know, via rail having to buy accessible cars. Well, okay, what is accessibility? And as you pointed out, Elliot, it is different for all of us, and is different for us depending on how we're coming into the space and what the space is. And so even winning that, we lost something. We didn't necessarily specify everything that needs to be involved in that. So that's why our look at human rights and social justice, pulling that together and having these intersectional conversations, is so critical, because we don't want to keep going on only looking at that one way of thinking. We need to expand that to include, when we do legal work in this country around these things, that we are not being one note, that we are an orchestra, and we are including all of those, that symphony of knowledge and understanding in our briefs and in our test case litigation. And that's critical as well, that of work that we're just really beginning now at CCD after 47 years. So it's ongoing. We can be proud of the fact that we're still here, and we're still working towards something that we don't quite know what it's going to look like or exactly how to get there. But we do know, if we have these kinds of discussions on a continuous basis, we will progress, because it's our voices together, not someone else defining how we're going to do it. And that's great. Just as we're coming to the end, I'd just like to recognize Henrietta Davis Rye, who's with DPI and Disability People International. She's the president, and she joined this webinar today. And thank you for being here, Henrietta. Much appreciated. And also, we're going to do our final poll, but just a final word or anything, Elliot, Lisa, and Ben, thank you for an incredible conversation, and also just to ask you, have any short parting words?
I do, if I may. When we're looking at, it's Lisa, when we're looking at common ground and we're trying to evaluate different identities and trying to figure out how we can best evaluate accessibility, the easiest way is to go back to a rights perspective, to make sure that everybody is afforded those rights, those inherent rights as human beings. And if somebody is not able to access certain parts of education, employment, financial stability, housing, medical care, all of those aspects, that's where we need to concentrate on accessibility, not just for disability per se, but for all marginalized groups, because then that's how we incorporate intersectionality, is through a rights perspective.
Thank you. Ben, do you have any last words?
Yeah, I'd leave off with the last words of just like you were saying, when it does come to disability rights and disability justice, it's important that we're going to start evolving. So I think it's about time that we get that sledgehammer, we bash in that table, we start making pathways and doorways, and we put up that wallpaper that says everybody has rights. And me as a person with disability and as a person who has multiple intersecting identities, and put that up and say it loud and proud for sure.
I don't know what happened to your
Elliot,
sound,
go.
Heather.
I'm sorry. Go ahead, Elliot.
great.
Allez-y, Elliot, désolé.
The one thing that I would say is don't get hung up on this idea of perfection. Perfection is not going to be something that's achievable, and we can work towards that. But I think perfection often holds us back from leaning into these things that can be quite uncomfortable to confront and can stop us from meeting each other where we're at and really respecting who it is that we're building relationships with and allowing them to be themselves.
Great. Thank you, Elliot. April, your hand's up. And then we're going to go to the poll.
Yes, thank you, Heather. Just to let everyone know, there in the chat, there's a link to the evaluation form for the webinar. So it'd be great if participants could fill out that evaluation form. Thank you very much. Over to you, Heather.
Thank you, April. So Alan, could you send out the second poll? Be appreciated. Everyone is just receiving that. If you could click on that and fill that out. I'd also like to thank the interpreters for your great work and your very good way of ensuring that we all hear, see, and can feel the way that people have been bringing the information forward. It isn't just a flat way that you interpret, and we very much appreciate that humanness you bring to it. And we're up to about 65%, I think it says, of the final poll.
Minimize button. Pow.
I'll give it another minute. And I'd also like to thank everyone for joining us on this webinar and on this wonderful week that as I said earlier, this should be a daily discussion always. And I'm very grateful to our three panelists, Elliot, Lisa, and Ben, for coming and sharing today and really helping us get a grip on a direction that we're going, and taking us out of a place of victimization and into action. that is comfortable and is safer, because not any of us are safe, feels totally safe. So this has been a very good way, I think, and a safer way to share what you had to say, and I thank you for that. Okay, I think people have filled out as many people wanted to, and I guess I'll turn it back to you, Elizabeth, to, if you have anything to say to end this webinar. Thank you again. Elizabeth, are you still there?
Alert from messages. CC.
Ellen, you can end the poll, and thank you all. You're all released this Friday afternoon, and for some of us, it almost is still